ISIS-K has claimed responsibility for the terror attack that claimed the lives of 13 U.S. service members at the airport in Kabul, as well as rockets that were launched unsuccessfully at the airport on Monday. So who is ISIS-K? What is their relationship, if any, to the Taliban and to al-Qaeda? And why are they attacking U.S. troops as we're evacuating the country? To answer these questions and some additional questions from all of you, I'm so happy to be joined by Emily Harding. She is Deputy Director and Senior Fellow with the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, previously Deputy Staff Director at the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and an expert in all of this. Emily, thank you so much for your time today.
Happy to be here.
So my first question is, ISIS-K continues to pose a threat to the U.S. as we're leaving the country. How is it that they're able to do this?
Right. The American presence in Afghanistan did a really very good job knocking ISIS-K back over the last few years. They were weakened from their previous presence. But as the Taliban moved forward, they did several things that helped ISIS-K, despite their better judgment. They released a bunch of prisoners from several prisons, and amongst those were ISIS-K fighters. And that was going to bolster ISIS-K's ranks. The other thing is that this group knows they only have a few days in which to exact some casualties on the Americans and also to make a statement that they're going to challenge the Taliban. And they took advantage of that time.
Okay, let's back up for a minute and establish who is ISIS-K as distinct from the ISIS we always heard about in Syria. And what is their relationship to the Taliban?
So ISIS-K is actually a bit of a misnomer. The ISIS piece actually refers to the ISIS that was in Syria and Iraq. It was Iraq and al-Shams, which is another word for the area around Syria. ISIS-K is ISIS Khorasan, and Khorasan is another region, historic from a long time ago, that covers parts of Afghanistan and parts of Iran. So they claimed that they were the rightful owners of the caliphate that might encompass parts of Afghanistan and parts of neighboring countries. And they were ideologically affiliated with ISIS from Syria and Iraq. And there were some ties there, some assistance, but it's kind of a spin-off group. You can think about it that way. As far as their relationship with the Taliban, it's bad to put it in one word. The Taliban and ISIS-K look at each other as rivals. ISIS-K thinks the Taliban is not extreme enough for them. They would actually run a more extreme version. It would look a lot more like what happened in Syria. And the Taliban also thinks that the ISIS-K folks are destabilizing, they're a challenge to their rule, and they would like to see them gone, which is why they have been, in some ways, aligned with US interests on just this one narrow issue.
And then how does al-Qaeda play into all of that? Does al-Qaeda is closer to the Taliban? Are they then at odds with ISIS-K?
You could say that, yes. The Taliban and al-Qaeda have had a relationship now for well over 25 years. The Taliban has had multiple opportunities to disown al-Qaeda, to denounce them, and they haven't done it. In fact, over the last 20 years or so, the Taliban fighters and the al-Qaeda guys have managed to intermarry. It's a family now, just as much as it is a governing structure. And one of the things that I'm very concerned about is that with the Taliban's rise, al-Qaeda is going to reclaim a presence inside Afghanistan. Now, al-Qaeda is going to be more aligned with the Taliban than they are with ISIS-K, though.
So the way I think of it, and tell me if this is correct, is that people have asked me, how is the Taliban different from al-Qaeda? I think of the Taliban as a force that rules with brutality within Afghanistan, but doesn't launch foreign terror strikes, whereas al-Qaeda launches foreign terror strikes, but isn't a governing entity.
That's absolutely right. Okay. Yep. The Taliban has always sought to control Afghanistan and run it as their own government. Al-Qaeda was a group that was allowed safe passage, that was allowed to be in Afghanistan and train. Back in the late 90s, they brought a lot of money into Afghanistan that the Taliban needed. So then it was a marriage of convenience.
And when you say that ISIS-K does things that are sort of more extreme than what the Taliban or even al-Qaeda would want, what do they do where al-Qaeda is like, no, that's a bridge too far for us?
I mean, this is where we get into the truly horrible parts of ISIS. What we saw in Syria was ISIS fighters that were kidnapping women and using them in whatever way they saw fit. We saw, rampant violence, beheadings, a really extreme interpretation of Islam, where if you didn't buy into exactly what ISIS said should happen, then you were probably killed by them. The Taliban also have a very brutal interpretation of Islam. Things like, suggesting that women shouldn't go to school, that women shouldn't work. The Taliban's current messaging, where they're saying that they will allow women to go to school just as long as it's a separate school, and they will allow women to work just as long as it's separate work and appropriate work, I think ISIS would probably find that abhorrent and would say that women are supposed to be in the home and protected at all times.
Is there a religious difference? Is one Shia, one Sunni, or no?
They're both Sunni.
Okay.
Taliban has a Sunni interpretation of Islam, and so does al-Qaeda, and so does ISIS. On the Shia side, you're mostly looking at groups more like Hezbollah.
Okay. So the Biden administration keeps saying that the Taliban was not complicit with ISIS in any of these attacks. That's their belief. I talk to experts and analysts who kind of roll their eyes and say, which Taliban? Like, how do they know? What's your take on that? And can you explain why there might be some skepticism?
I totally understand the rolling of the eyes. Yes. So we talk about the Taliban. They are a group, but it would be impossible to say that the Taliban in Kabul have any command and control over Taliban all across the country. And they're not an organized army the way that you would think of the American army. There's not going to be really strict rules that govern how people act in their various provinces. So sure, there are going to be some folks fighting for the Taliban who may have sympathies with ISIS-K. There may be some folks fighting for the Taliban who are making calculations on their own that, hey, I'm not looking to get in the way of a suicide bomber. I'm going to let this guy through. So it's really difficult to say, the Taliban doesn't agree and would not help ISIS. That's probably true. As a group, that would be their policy. But that doesn't guarantee that every person in their organization would feel the same way.
What poses the greatest threat to the Taliban leadership as they move forward? There are many factions within the country. You sort of tease out for us some of the challenges the Taliban faces as they try to stand up a government.
The biggest challenge to the Taliban right now is honestly themselves. With every insurgency that you've seen across the world, as soon as that common outside enemy is gone and disposed of, the factions turn on themselves. So I could see a lot of sharp elbows. I could see angling for resources and positions. I could see that potentially turning violent if some people don't like the way that those resources and positions are being handed out. There's a lot of talk in the Biden administration right now about trying to incorporate the Taliban into the international community to improve pressure on them, to try and encourage them to behave a certain way. I would suspect that for the next year or so, they're going to be almost completely internally focused and trying to figure out how to set up their own government and less concerned about what's going to happen on the international stage.
The way it's been explained to me, you have sort of local leaders. It's still in a way tribal. And so you have the arbitrariness of your local leader might be more flexible and lenient from a Western point of view, or more rigid and ideological and repressive. So it's sort of hard to predict what life will be like under Taliban rule, but can you give us a general sense of what's likely to change?
So that's absolutely right. Afghanistan is a very diverse place. There are lots of ethnic groups. With the diverse terrain, it's almost impossible to have consistent communications even throughout the country. So that regional viewpoint on this is the way that I'm going to run things in my province as opposed to that province, you can almost think of it as a more extreme version of the way the United States is. Governors have a lot of power over their own laws and how they're going to run their own state. The Afghanistan is a lot like that. The things that are going to change, with the Taliban in charge, everyone in Afghanistan is going to remember how brutal they were in the late 90s. And there's going to be a lot of fear and a lot of hesitation to push back on them. What's going to be very interesting is to see in the last 20 years, the people of Afghanistan, their expectations have been raised rather dramatically on what's possible. Women have been going to school. Women have been working. There's been much greater freedom to be exposed to the West, to be exposed to modern technology. It's going to be very difficult for the Taliban, I think, to try to take that away. But I think we're already seeing them attempt to do it through considerable oppression. The stories coming out about them going from house to house and looking for people who helped the Americans, who helped the UK, are terrifying. And that, to me, is them showing their true colors.
What do you think is going to happen in the next 2 weeks? I've heard some horrifying speculation about what's likely to happen. What do you believe is real?
I mean, there's going to be huge amounts of internal displacement in Afghanistan. You're seeing a lot of people who are very afraid and they're leaving their houses, but they don't feel like they can cross a border. Most of the borders are closed. So they're not yet traveling across borders into Iran or into Pakistan. They're moving inside the country. That's really not sustainable. At some point, they're going to try to find a way out. I could see a lot of people suddenly knocking on Pakistan's door and saying, hey, we're coming in. Pakistan already has a huge Afghan refugee population, and I suspect they're about to get a lot more. Iran, too, is going to have to make a decision about whether they open their borders to another round of Afghan refugees. I think in the next 2 weeks, you're going to see, like I said, the infighting amongst the Taliban really start as far as positions go. We've already seen them reaching out to the Turks, and then I believe also the Qataris, about coming in to help them run the airport and just keep some of the technical aspects of Kabul running. Some of that I suspect is going to fall apart.
We also could be leaving behind some Americans. Could you imagine a scenario in which they go after the Americans left behind and we end up seeing that?
Absolutely. I think that's entirely possible. I think we'll see maybe some Americans suffering. I think we may see some of the folks who worked with the Americans suffering. I think that cell phone video that's going to come out is going to be absolutely heartbreaking when it happens. I am still hopeful that the vast majority of American citizens get out before tomorrow. I am also hopeful that if they don't get out, that we follow up on our promises to help them get out either over land or some other way. But I do know that, one of the missions that we are committed to following through on here, that the U.S. military is committed to following through on, is getting every single American out of Afghanistan.
One question I've gotten frequently is, why are they attacking us? Why is ISIS-K attacking us? I should be specific. On our way out, people ask, we're leaving anyway. Why hit us now?
Their mission really is to prove that their weird, twisted version of Islam is the only proper way to go about life. And one of the ways that they raise awareness, if you want to put it that way, one of the ways they get attention to their own brand of Islam is by carrying out these attacks. They are clearly, God is with them because they are taking out their toll on the non-believers. They use these videos and things as propaganda. They spread it around the world to try to recruit more followers to their cause. The more casualties that they can incur, the more powerful they look to potential followers down the line. So it really is, a terror attack in the truest sense of the word. They're trying to make people scared and make people believe in them.
For people who don't understand what the implications of a failed state are, can you explain to us what this mix of factors really means for the U.S.? You talked about al-Qaeda having, some close relations with the Taliban, creating some space for ISIS-K, the instability with Pakistan, our inability to see into the country. What does this mean for our security here in the U.S.?
The counterterrorism threat really is the most direct implication here. In a space like Afghanistan, we were talking earlier about how the Taliban doesn't necessarily have complete command and control over the entire country. There are going to be lots of pockets of ungoverned spaces all over Afghanistan. Nature abhors a vacuum. Politics abhors a vacuum. It's a place where groups can safely plan, where they can pull in supporters, where they can look at ways to attack the US. I will say that we've gotten very good as a country at find, fix, and finish, at trying to identify a potential terrorist threat, at bolstering security at our borders, our airports. We're much better at it than we used to be. I do worry, though, that as soon as we leave Afghanistan, we're going to have much less insight into what's going on the ground. And some of the things that the Biden administration's talked about, the over-the-horizon intelligence capabilities, I think that's a bit of a rosy picture. Our intelligence community is very good at what they do, but trying to get good access into a mountainous, denied area where you've got Iran on one border and Pakistan on the other, and neither one is eager to give us overflight rights or anything, is going to be very challenging. So the counterterrorism threat really is the number one. I think the number two threat that we have to look at is really a very sad threat, and that is the outflow of refugees. They are going to leave, and a lot of them are going to want to come either to the US or to Europe. A lot of countries in Europe are already reeling still from the Syrian refugee crisis from before. Those refugees, many of them were welcomed with open arms. However, we saw countries like Russia attempt to deepen divides in society by using false information about those refugees. We saw some countries really stirring up far-right reactionary forces to the inflow of these refugees. And I think it's really on every single person to think hard before they retweet, to think hard before they repost, and try and decide if something is true and fair to the new neighbors that we're all welcoming.
One of the claims you just referenced it, this notion that we won't have sort of eyes and ears on the ground in Afghanistan after we leave. I find that hard to believe. We're not going to be there gathering intelligence even after the US presence in a public way is gone?
Not in the near term. When we pull out of an embassy, we're pulling out our diplomats, but we're also pulling out some capabilities as well. And one of the things that gave us our best insight into Afghanistan were the troops that we had on the ground talking to the Afghan National Security Forces. I mean, we were working together to try and combat some very serious threats. And so the local Afghans would come to our diplomats and tell them what was going on. They would come to their partners in American Special Forces and tell them what was going on, and that would get reported back up the chain and is part of the intelligence collection. Also, we just gave up all of our military bases in Afghanistan. So if you're looking at an over-the-horizon capability, what you're really talking about is basing unmanned aircraft out of places like the Gulf. That is a 6-hour flight time from the Gulf into Afghanistan. And once again, over denied airspace. I can't imagine that Iran is going to say, sure, overfly our territory and keep an eye on this threat. So you're looking at 6 hours to get there, a dwell time while you're there, and then 6 hours to get back. And that just greatly reduces the amount of information you can really collect. Also, as I mentioned, Afghanistan's got mountainous territory, all of those valleys and hillsides and caves. There's only so much that you can really collect once you have line of sight if you've got mountains and things in the way. It's just a very challenging intelligence picture. We've gotten very good at it, but it's just not going to be the same level of insight that we had 3 months ago.
How concerned are you about the weapons left behind?
I'm not that concerned. I mean, a lot of it's going to be small arms that, Afghanistan was already swimming in small arms, so it's really not going to be that big a deal. I don't think we would have left behind anything that would have a big impact on airplanes flying in and out of the country, although that's always a concern. I'm guessing that a lot of the heavier equipment that we left behind either was inoperable or would be very difficult to maintain if you didn't know what you were doing. One of the ways that America fights these days is we have very high-tech weaponry that only we can maintain. So I'm guessing that what is left behind is going to be less useful.
I mean, they could bring in outside expertise, but I take your point. So a question about, are you worried about the biometric data, which is actual identity information about the Afghans who worked with us, sort of databases or lists of who worked with the US that the Taliban could use to sort of ferret out who they perceive as enemies?
Sure. In this brave new world that we're in, data is a weapon. There's going to be a lot of information left behind. I'm assuming that the American embassy did what they are trained to do and destroyed everything that they had on hand. What I'm less sure of is maybe some of our allies who abandoned their embassies in Kabul, or some of the Afghan National Security Forces. I don't know if their databases and their holdings were wiped, but if the Taliban gets their hands on biometric data, just names and addresses, names of extended family of those who helped us, that can be a roadmap to finding and trying to either arrest or kill the people who assisted us while we were on the ground.
So tragic if they get that. The US government, I should say, denies that they left any biometric data, that it's in databases that we control in the cloud and they can destroy. But that has been challenged by people with knowledge. So I don't know what the truth is.
I mean, if it's in the cloud, they would have had to destroy the actual equipment that's on the ground in Afghanistan. And they are trained to do that. I mean, the State Department personnel, they all take a course where they learn how to, physically destroy their computer equipment.
Do you have a theory? We obviously clearly have very good intelligence on what ISIS-K's movements are, because the US has been able to successfully deter two terror attacks, I think. One was an attempted shooting down of planes, and the other was in the city streets. Do you think that's our intelligence, or do you think we have a partner in another country is feeding us this information?
Now, not having seen the intelligence myself, I would say that it's both. We have excellent partnerships with various allied countries that also have accesses. And so we tend to share, especially when it comes to the counterterrorism fight, we share with pretty much everybody. I think that our intelligence on ISIS-K has been very good. The way that they were able to identify the potential car bomb in the streets of Kabul and then strike that was usually has something to do with the way that you can either pick up on comms, or you have human reporting that comes in and tells you that this is something that's about to happen, it's imminent. They also knew that ISIS-K was going to try to take advantage of these last few days to try and make a big statement. But finding an actual vehicle-borne explosive device and striking it in a crowded street is always risky, and you want very good intelligence before you make that decision. On the rocket attack, somebody had turned a car into a rocket launcher, and you can see the pictures online. They have tried to fire out the back window of the car at the airport. If those rockets had succeeded, they might have hit an aircraft, they might have hit the runway. One of the downsides to Kabul airport is that there's one runway. So if that runway is taken out somehow, then there's just no other way to get planes off the ground there. But we had the CRAM system still in place, and it shot down those rockets as they approached. There were no casualties that we know of yet, although I believe one building in Kabul was lit on fire because of the misfire.
And I should say our intelligence clearly wasn't perfect, because 13 service members lost their lives there to an ISIS-K attack.
It is a very sad story. I mean, that one, they clearly knew it was coming. They clearly had seen some kind of intelligence that suggested that an attack was imminent. They were moving to close the Abbey Gate. But from what I understand, they kept it open a little bit longer because the UK was attempting to pull a bunch of their citizens out through that gate from the hotel. And so it just shows the commitment to mission. Those service members knew that they were in grave danger, and they decided to complete the mission.
It's remarkable. Can we talk about Pakistan for a moment? Pakistan has sort of, it's a notional ally, but really also an adversary. Would you speak to how a destabilized Afghanistan poses a threat to Pakistan, and what that means for us? I mean, they're a nuclear power.
In this situation, Pakistan really is kind of the dog that caught the car. They have been eager to see the US harassed in Afghanistan. They have been less than helpful occasionally when it comes to fighting back against the Taliban. Various parts of Pakistan have long-standing ties to the Taliban and excellent information streams. Pakistan has been not exactly the next door neighbor that Afghanistan would have wanted if it wanted to become the stable and productive country that we had hoped it would be. When you look at data on insurgencies from around the world, one of the things that is the most successful indicator of an insurgency is if they have a next door neighbor that is supporting the insurgents. That's exactly what happened here. So Taliban are going to look at Pakistan now and ask them for all kinds of things. They're going to ask them for money. They're going to ask them for support. Pakistan is going to be forced with a decision about, are they going to support the Taliban and try to help create a stable Afghanistan? Are they going to open their borders to Afghan refugees? What are they going to do now? Because some of this terrorist threat could turn against their territory. I think that they may see the Americans leaving as a victory in a sense, but at the same time, they are going to have a whole host of problems coming out of their neighbor next door.
Is there a possibility that a more radical Afghanistan radicalizes Pakistan, and then you end up with an al-Qaeda kind of government and a Taliban kind of government in Pakistan with a nuclear bomb? Or is that just a scary nightmare scenario that's unrealistic?
Oh, it's a scary nightmare to be sure. That's what we would in the intelligence community call a low probability, high impact scenario. If you look at the way that the ethnic groups are scattered across Afghanistan and Pakistan, there's a part in the west of Pakistan that is very closely tied to Afghanistan. And that part of Pakistan has been ungoverned and kind of a spillover area for Afghanistan for a very long time. Now, the Pakistani government knows what they're doing, and they've been dealing with this problem for a long time. They have tried to contain the threats to that area as much as possible. They've tried to keep tabs on that area. They've made deals with tribal leaders where they can to be sure that any kind of radicalization that you're talking about stays in the west of the country and doesn't migrate across Pakistan to the capital. Spillover effects like that are very difficult to contain. And while I would see it being a true long shot that you see instability in Islamabad, it's possible, and it's something that the intelligence community is going to have to keep an eye on. This kind of thing where you would sit down with a group of analysts and say, okay, what indications and warning are we looking for that Pakistan is becoming destabilized because of the situation in Afghanistan? And then you would look to see how many of those get ticked off over the coming months or years, and just really keep an eye on that situation. Because as you mentioned, they are a nuclear power right next to another nuclear power. Those two are on the brink more often than we'd like.
How is the Muslim world reacting to the US's pullout from Afghanistan? And do you think the Muslim world should be doing more or is doing enough for the refugees who are coming out?
I think they should do much more. I mean, with all the thanks in the world to the Qataris who have allowed all the Afghan refugees, or many Afghan refugees, to fly there on their way to more permanent homes. The Gulf in particular has a lot of money and a lot of resources. They could do a lot to support these refugees as they exit Afghanistan. One of my colleagues pointed out that, you have Qatari military forces or Emirati military forces or Saudi military forces who could be on the ground in Afghanistan helping people get from Kabul into the airport. They could be the escort that some of these women need or that some of these families need. And they're not there. So I would really appreciate it if they would step up and help in a great many ways. I think that the proof is going to be in the pudding there in the months to come. They could be helping reach out to the Taliban and increase pressure on them to do the right thing when it comes to governing. They could be providing technical assistance. They could be, the Emiratis in particular could be there and saying, yes, we are going to support you in coming up with universities for your students. And as long as you remain on the straight and narrow when it comes to dealing with your people, then we will help you with financial assistance. It's a thing that they could do that we can't.
I want to just sort of give people a sense of what this means. 9/11, the 20th anniversary of 9/11 is coming. It must be it's both symbolically important to the US. This has all sorts of significance sort of for whatever it means, our standing in the world. But also I imagine that will be a date terrorists will try to strike at the US and US allies. What do you foresee for 9/11?
The terrorist groups have occasionally targeted that date just to reiterate that they still exist and that they haven't been completely defeated yet. Our intelligence community experts are going to be on high alert looking for any potential threat coming at 9/11. I think the bigger deal for 9/11 this year is going to be in the hearts of the intelligence community folks who have fought this war quietly for 20 years, in the hearts of the soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines who have fought this fight for the last 20 years. I really hope that they aren't left wondering, what did we do it all for? Because we know what they did it for. We know that in the last 20 years, women and girls went to school. Many terrorist threats were averted. There are Americans alive today who wouldn't have been if they hadn't been fighting in Afghanistan. I joined the CIA in 2003. I was on the leading edge of the hiring binge right after 9/11. 9/11 was my first day in grad school. We all thought that they were running an exercise on us, that I was going to a school for policy analysis, and we thought that they were playing a game. They were saying, this thing just happened, how are you going to react to it? But then we're quickly disabused of that notion. And the agency came in recruiting because they needed a lot of folks to do the hard work of fighting back against this terrorist group. And my generation of analysts, our career really has been defined by this fight. There's a lot of senior leadership across the US government who has been scarred or shaped or formed by fighting this fight in the trenches with their fellow Americans. And it's going to be, I think, a tough day for a lot of them.
Emily, I'm really grateful for your time and for sharing your knowledge and perspective.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jessica Yellin. If you like this video, please click subscribe, and you can click the bell to get notifications when we post new content. Thanks for watching.